Hello, today we're going to be talking about Apache Camel, which is an integration tool that you can roll into your own applications. And the example we'll be walking through is integrating with Facebook, downloading your Facebook homepage feed using Apache Camel. So what we're going to do is we're going to start with a few slides going through the basics of Apache Camel if you're not familiar with it. Then we're going to switch to some code. We're going to write a camel route. We're going to have it download your home feed from Facebook using the appropriate security settings. We'll use a camel type converter to change the message format that's visible in Camel. We'll use the built-in Camel logging to see what result we got from Facebook, and then we'll set up a unit test to run this all. So this is the big picture of the integration scenario we're looking at. We're going to start a Camel route. It will download data from Facebook. It will split that into one message per Facebook update. Then we'll drop the messages that contain photos and videos. We'll just keep the text in the URLs. Then for each of those messages, we'll download more likes and comments than come down in the big feed. And then we'll save that all on a message-by-message basis to the application's database. But we're not doing all that today. Today we're just going to work through the first part of this, setting up the Camel route, downloading the data from Facebook, and putting together a unit test to demonstrate that it's all working. And then in a follow-on screencast, we'll go through the rest of this process and show how to handle the rest of it. Now, Apache Camel is basically a set of common code for many of your integration needs. It handles routing and transformation, a lot of the enterprise integration patterns like content-based routers and filters and splitters. It supports many transports and protocols. We'll see a list of just some of those in a moment. And you can easily integrate it with Spring, with Service Mix, with OSGI, and with other platforms. Now, Camel is not really a product that stands alone. You don't run a Camel server in addition to your application. Instead, it's pretty lightweight, and you typically roll it into your application, and that's how you would deploy it. Now, key concepts for Camel. Camel context holds a set of routes. Each of those routes can be defined in XML or in a domain-specific language, typically in Java, though there are a couple other options as well. The routes use various endpoints to get the messages in and out, and those are configured by a variety of components. We're not going to deal too much with that in this screencast, but we'll see more about that in a follow-on. The routes may use expression languages or scripting languages or things like that to manipulate the messages or to define a filter or whatever the case may be. We'll see some examples of that. And what's actually going through each of these routes are individual exchanges. Each exchange can have an input message and possibly an output message. And each of those messages has a data format that it uses. And we'll see more about how to use the messages in the data formats today. Now, a route is a path typically between two endpoints, an incoming endpoint and an outgoing endpoint, though you may have some additional ones along the way. And the route basically includes processing between those two endpoints. So you can manipulate the message, you could save it to a database, you could log it, you could filter it, and so on and so forth between the incoming route and the outgoing route. Now, those routes, again, can be defined in several ways, but those definitions are processed once when the Camel context starts up. So the routes are just running as defined for the life cycle of the Camel context. Now, if you look at an individual message, it is pretty generic. It has message headers, it has message body, and it has attachments. So this could represent a JMS message, an email message, or whatever. And the message body can be converted between different data formats, a CSV file, an XML file, an input stream, and so on and so forth. So we'll see how to manipulate that message body and the message headers and things along the way. So if you're going ahead and deploying Camel, the easiest way to do it is a Spring application, in which case you just have to add some Camel jars to your class path. There's a Camel core jar, and then there are other jars with specific functionality you can add on to Camel, and we'll see some examples of that as well. In your Spring configuration file, you just add one Camel context element, and it uses the nice syntax introduced in Spring 2 where you can define specific XML tags for specific functions. So we'll see how that works. It's very straightforward. Your IDE can do code completion on the XML configuration file or the Java DSL syntax. So It's easy to write your Camel routes, and then either they'll be defined right there in the XML, or your XML will tell it where to look for the Java DSL classes or a Scala DSL classes or whatever that define the routes. Now it's very easy to get this working with Maven. You just add the Camel dependencies to your Maven POM. This is a typical example, and so that's what we'll do in the example a little later. And if we're looking at what kind of input and output Camel supports, there's a big list. It supports JMS, it supports Java Beans and Spring Beans that can manipulate the message. It supports web services, REST and SOAP. You can pull files, you can send them over HTTP, FTP, you can send emails or receive emails. There's a scheduler that can kick off routes. It can interact with databases. You can apply velocity templates or XSL style sheets. You can do all kinds of things to your messages. So if you're interested in seeing everything that Camel can do, the website has a big list of all the different Camel components that you can include in your routes. Now when it comes to testing, you can use the same Spring configuration file that defined your basic Camel routes and use that in a test environment. The only difference is you might use some mock components to override your endpoints in that. So if you don't want to use a live JMS server, for example, in your unit test, you can use a mock component to substitute. And you can also use a mock component to evaluate the state at the end of the route to make sure that the route did the correct processing and the message that went through to the end is what you expected. Now, when you look at what it takes to actually build Camel into your application, Camel itself is quite lightweight, under 5 megabytes for Camel and all the support jars. The only area where it will tend to bloat a little is when you start pulling in the dependencies of all these Camel features. So if you're using several different scripting languages in your routes, then their implementation jars will add up. If you're using SOAP and REST and JMS, then you'll have jars for all of those things. So it will tend to add up depending on what's in your routes, but it's still much lighter weight than a typical standalone ESB or integration server product. So that's about it for the crash course on Camel. Now we're going to actually dig into some code and see how to put this all together. So we're going to start by just making a basic project structure. We're going to create a POM to kick this off. I'm pasting in basically the boilerplate part of the POM. This is what you'd see on every project. Now we're going to go ahead and add in the Camel dependencies, which is the more interesting part. This looks just like what we showed in the slides earlier. We're going to go ahead and try to build this just to make sure there are no errors in the POM. So we'll do the quick Maven install, and then once that's done, we can go ahead and set up the project. So we're just going to create some source directories here, test directory, and then we can load the whole thing up into the IDE. So in the IDE, we're going to open the project. We're going to just make sure that it comes in okay, and then we'll start with the Spring configuration file to define the routes. So here we are creating a new XML file. I'll call it facebook.xml, and I'll paste in kind of the basic structure of a Spring XML configuration file. So this is just the basic boilerplate of a Spring configuration file with a Camel context XML element and an empty route. So this is pretty much what every XML route definition is going to look like. And we'll go on now and populate the route. So here's what the route needs to do. We want to take some input to begin the route, format the URL to connect to Facebook, call Facebook, format the response into a string, log it, and then finish it off. So to start the route, we're going to define an endpoint using the direct component, which lets you put a message directly into the Camel route. We're going to assume that message has a header defined with the access token we need to connect to Facebook. So we're going to stick that access token into the URL that we're actually going to use to connect to Facebook. Now you'll see here we're defining a new header on the message called the Camel HTTP URI. We're using the simple expression language to define an expression which is going to become the value of that header. So the expression we're defining here is a base URL, and then we have the little part in curly braces that is pulling out the access token from the existing header and sticking it into the URL, which we're then putting into the new header. Now the next step here is to actually call Facebook. It's a simple HTTP call, so we're going to use the Camel HTTP component. One of the tricks here is that if you've defined a message header called camel HTTP URI, it takes priority over whatever URI you put in the configuration file. So I'm just putting in www.facebook.com. It doesn't really matter what you put here. It's just going to be overridden by the header we configured in the set header statement right before this. Now, if you tried out what we've got up to this point, you'd discover that the message is left with an input stream as the message body, which isn't all that friendly. So what we want to do is convert it to be a string, and there's an easy element we can add to the config file to just change the format of the message body, and now we'll have a string, which is really what we'd like to have in the message body to begin with. So now we've got the string in there, we can go ahead and log the response and see what we got back from Facebook. So Camel has a component that can send messages to a system log as well. So we'll put in a log URI here, and we can then look in the console output when we run this or test it and make sure we're getting something sensible, something that we expect from Facebook. So the last step is to go ahead and finish off the route. In this case, we're going to send it to a mock component, which will let us evaluate again at the end of our test whether we got the right message back from Facebook. So if we just look back at what we've done here, we have set up a route that has an input. It will accept a direct message from a caller. It's going to assume that that message has a header on it providing an access token used to connect to Facebook. It's going to then set a new header, camel HTTP URI, format that to be a URL that includes the access token. It's going to call Facebook using the camel HTTP component. It uses a camel type converter to convert the body to a string. It uses the camel log component to log the message, and then it sends it to a camel mock component which our test can evaluate. So in this little bit of route, we've actually encapsulated a surprising amount of logic. You could write this all in Java code, but here it is right in our config file. So the next thing we're going to do is write a unit test to demonstrate this route in action. So it's going to be a very simple JUnit4 unit test. It's going to run our route, call Facebook, check the output, make sure everything went okay. So again, it starts as a plain JUnit4 unit test, but what we're going to do is make it extend the Camel Spring Test Support class. That class knows how to set up a Camel context and run it before your tests run. So all we have to do is tell it where to find the Spring configuration file for the Camel context. So here we're just going to have it load that off the class path. We're going to point it to that facebook.xml file we just wrote, and then we can go on and write the actual unit test method. Now the unit test here has 4 things it needs to do. The first thing it needs to do is set up the message it's going to send into the route. So set up the access token, put that in a header, prepare the message. The second thing it's going to do is configure the mock endpoint. Tell it that it's going to get one message out of the route if everything goes successfully. The third thing it's going to do is actually call the route, and then the fourth thing is going to be to ensure that the mock endpoint got the message we were expecting to see. So if you look at the code we're writing here, the first bits set up that access token value. Then we're going to go ahead and configure the mock endpoint, tell it what we're expecting to get out of the route. Then we put that access token into a map of headers. Then we send that into the route. And then at the end, the last thing we do is ask the mock endpoint whether it got the one message we were expecting. Now the one thing we haven't done yet is actually get a valid access token. So for purposes of this demonstration, we're going to get the quick and easy access token that you can get just by visiting a page at Facebook. So we go to their API developer documentation. We're going to go to the documentation for the Graph API. And then scrolling down the page a little, you can see they give you a link to see the homepage feed that has a valid access token value in it. We're going to copy that link, paste it into our code, strip off everything but the access token. Now we can go ahead and call Facebook. And this access token lasts for a couple of minutes at the most. So, you can do this for your testing, but you're going to have to do something different for a long-term solution. So now we're ready to go ahead and try this test out and see if everything works. So we run it, and we're shortly going to find out whether this all went smoothly. Looks like no. So what we got to figure out is what happened, and looking through the stack trace, we'll figure out pretty quickly that Camel wasn't able to make the HTTP call. The message we actually get, no component found with scheme HTTP, that means that Camel can't find a Camel component to handle the endpoint that starts with HTTP. So why could that be? In this case, it's because we don't have the right dependencies set up in our project. I left out the Camel HTTP component. So all we've got to do is go into the Maven POM. We'll copy one of the existing dependencies there, just overwrite it to be the Camel HTTP component. And now we can try running this test again, and we'll see if that goes any better. So running the test again, let's see what we get. Everything seems to have passed. We're going to scroll up a little and look at what we got from Facebook. This is the result of the log statement. This is the actual message body, and so in this case it's the data we got from Facebook. If you look closely, you can see it's in JSON format, and we'll make that a little clearer in just a second. Okay, so here's what the beginning of the message actually looks like. You get a decent number of status updates from Facebook in each call. So if you format it a little, you can see it's valid JSON. This is what we were expecting to get. So in the next part of the screencast, what we'll do is start splitting this up into different messages for the different Facebook status updates. We can do the filtering, saving to the database, and all that kind of stuff. But for right now, we've seen the basic success. We set up a Camel route. When we set up the project correctly, we were able to write a unit test that route. It communicated with Facebook. It downloaded the data we were looking for, and all this with hardly a line of Java code. All we wrote is the actual unit test for it. So I hope you enjoyed this introduction to Apache Camel. We've gone through some of the possibilities of creating an easy integration using Camel and then writing some easy unit tests. And if you follow the additional screencasts in this series, you'll see more about, for example, how you can call POJOs from Camel, how you can apply some integration logic in your Camel routes and use some additional Camel components, and how you can build that into an application.